to the first speaker series event of the 2017-2018 school year. Thank you. It's good to see so many of you here. I'm actually going to keep my part really brief because I'm introducing the man who needs no introduction, Dr. Paul, our head of school and co-founder of Manzanita School. I do want to say a little bit about the Manzanita Institute, which is the branch of Manzanita that is taking our vision and our values outside of our community here at Big Rock Ranch and bringing these ideas and inspiration out into the world. It's really important and great that you can be here, and this is being recorded, so we're going to put it on our website, and you can send the link to people you know who you think should watch this lecture, discussion, conversation. I do also want to say that we have 2 other Institute events that are already on the calendar, so be excited for coming up on October 22nd. That's a Sunday. We're going to have actually a double header. 2 people are coming down from Quail Springs up in Ojai, with the Quail Springs. Brenton Kelly and Sasha Rabin are doing 2 discussions on permaculture and natural building design. So that's going to be October 22nd, a Sunday. And on Thursday, November 16th, we're going to be presenting a discussion on conceptual mathematics with Adam West. So mark your calendars. And without further ado, Dr. Paul.
Thanks, Claire. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Manzanita. I'm going to walk around a lot, so I hope it doesn't throw our camera people too much. Thank you, Claire. Claire's our director of the Manzanita Institute, and we have a few other Manzanita folks here. I want to say their names. We have Sage Ryan. He's our tech teacher and does some intervention math with students. He's all the way over there, and Ryan's next to him. He's our assistant head of school, and in front of him is Mr. Jonah. You guys should wave or something. And then there's Karen Anderson, our director of admissions, and behind her is Jenny, our director of special programs and art specialist, and Bridget, who teaches 5th grade. And Kamakshi, I think, has been helping a lot with animal science class after school, or end of the day specialist class. And Claire, I already mentioned. And Mr. Iyer over there is one of the high school teachers. He's also a naturalist. And Lauren, our office manager, is here. And Ariel Rowan, who's our director of operations and the director of Cali Camp. And Mr. Sean Berry, director of outdoor studies. Over here, Dave Van Beek, who is one of our naturalists and stewardship mentors. And I think I got everybody. If I didn't, my bad. So, So we're all a symbiotic community of beings running a symbiotic organism called Manzanita. And I have a few scientists up here. My grandfather was a rather famous physicist. He directed the National Bureau of Standards. He developed a lot of important technologies actually during the World War, Second World War. And a brilliant man, very quiet man. That's my father's father. My father's also a very renowned, famous cognitive scientist and educator, and he's back there sitting next to Jenny. Probably written 50 books or something. My mother's father was an engineer, and he directed this development of the urban waterways in northern Greece. So I have a lot of scientists in my family. And myself, I'm not a scientist really, but I dabble in science. So I have some scientists I want to introduce you to, just because they say cool stuff, and we'll start with them. You've already read this one, I'm sure. It's been sitting up for a while. But it's interesting that when you really look at what some of the most knowledgeable people in the sciences are saying about our world, it is so radically challenging a lot of the paradigms that emerged 300-400 years ago during the Cartesian revolution, the scientific revolution, which really made us all believe there was a physical universe that was mechanical, and then there were these beings called humans with souls, and everything else was an expression of a very complex machine. And I grew up with that paradigm, and I'm fighting it every day. But there's a lot of wonderful new information in the world that makes it a little easier to fight it. David Bohm was a famous physicist, and if you begin to think of some of these really far out ideas, it becomes harder and harder to hold on to really concrete, inflexible notions. He's just talking about something called zero-point energy and dark energy, and he concludes that in a single cubic inch of empty space, there's more energy than 1,000,000 atomic bombs. That's a scientific fact. But that energy is not yet accessible, or we're not able to tap into it. But it exists, and we live in this universe where everything that you can see, all the physical matter that we can see and measure, and all of the energy that's in that physical matter is now believed to represent only 4% of what's actually out there, and the rest is dark matter and dark energy. I have no idea what that means, but it makes me wonder what I also don't know about a lot of other things. So, and the last one I want to share with you is the Nobel laureate in physics, Max Born, and I love this. We have sought for firm ground and found none. The deeper we penetrate, the more restless becomes the universe. All is rushing about and vibrating in a wild dance. It sounds more like a poet. But I think that's what happens when you dig in deeply. It becomes a very poetic universe, even if you're a scientist. So welcome. I have a story about a squid. Just to start out this conversation about symbiosis. I'm going to talk a lot about that in terms of the natural world, and I'm going to talk about it also in terms of the cultural world. What does it mean to be interdependent, interconnected? So the story of the squid is just one of bioluminescence. There's a bacteria which is bioluminescent. It can turn on an illumination and emit light like a firefly. And it so happens that there's a squid that lives off the coast of Hawaii that is full of this bacteria. And it lives along the underlayer of its skin. And every night when it goes to sleep, it's a nocturnal hunter, it goes underneath the sand and it pumps all the bacteria out, almost all of it out. And the remaining bacteria begins to multiply, feeding off the food and nutrients provided by the squid. And it reaches this certain critical mass. And it's able to communicate. The bacteria have an amazing capacity. They've discovered this. They have a capacity to communicate with each other by the release of something similar to a pheromone. It's a molecule, and they have receptors and transmitters of these pheromones. And they wait to act. So if you have a bacteria in your body that's wishing to do you some harm, it will not act immediately because it will be attacked by antibodies. So it waits until it reaches a mass. And it's communicating with all the other bacteria. And when they reach this conclusion that they're at a certain level of mass, they take action. So bacteria are very intelligent. They've been around a lot longer than any of us. Single-celled organisms been on the planet. They were on the planet for 3 billion years before there were multicellular organisms. So they really had a long tenure here. And they're throughout your body, as you're going to find out in a few minutes. But the story of the squid is that the squid has a little aperture on the back of its body. And it can open the aperture and detect the amount of moonlight or stars. And what it does is it waits until there's a full moon, and then it opens up the aperture, it measures the amount of light, and then it signals symbiotically the bacteria, and they emit light, and then it lifts up off the seafloor. And the light emitted by the bacteria are equivalent to the moonlight on the back of this squid, so that it doesn't cast a shadow as it's hunting.
That's crazy.
Yes, what Kate said. And it gets crazier the deeper you dig. I'm just going to say this, so you can read it or not, but I'm going to say it. It's a little prose. You can close your eyes if you want. The grand upset has been the sense that we are apart, that we are different, that we are separate. It has understandable sources. The great Neolithic Revolution and the loss of an age-old ancestral culture that was full of beliefs and practices affirming and ensuring our connection to the more than human world. This was an intimacy nourished by biology and a belief in an interrelatedness of all things. As evolved symbiotic organisms, we emerged full from and within that which we now call nature. And as cultural beings, we explored, celebrated, and articulated our human symbiosis in family, tribe, and earth for untold millennia. So here's some shifts I want to share with you, and I mentioned these in our parent orientation, so you'll be familiar with them, those of you that came. The important thing here is that cultural ideas are often profoundly impacted by scientific discovery, but it doesn't happen immediately. But I want to share a couple of them. Nicholas Copernicus, we all know this story that he mathematically determined that the sun was spinning and the earth was spinning, but that the sun was not moving around the earth as we had thought, but that the earth was actually moving around the sun. So this was a huge, dramatic shift, and he was afraid to share it. So he only published the article about 6 months before he died. But he had the information for almost 15 years. He didn't want to talk about it because the intellectual elite and the theocracy of the time would have probably burned him at the stake. But he did determine that we live in a sun-centered universe. And that was groundbreaking and earth-shaking, and culturally it created immense upheaval initially. And those are these moments, and I'm going to argue that we're in one of those moments right now. And they're really hard to see when you're in them. And someone who claims that we're in one and starts spouting wild ideas like me might look crazy. Edwin Hubble. Before Edwin Hubble came along, the known universe was believed to be our galaxy. And then, through the use of his huge telescope, he identified that these nebula out in space were actually galaxies. And that, in fact, if he were to extrapolate from the little square inch of sky he was looking at and the number of galaxies he was seeing there, and everywhere he pointed that telescope, he determined that there's actually 10 billion of these galaxies out there. So he announces to the world in 1924 that the known universe we've all been using to evaluate our own size is actually 10 billion times bigger than we thought. That's a pretty big shift. That's a significant change to hear that. Something interesting you might not know, sometimes when you think about the vastness of space, I remember I was 19 and I was looking at stars in Santa Cruz, and I had a moment. I was in the middle of an astronomy class and I was on break, so I was very much in tune with distances, and I was really tabulating how far away the nearest stars were. And I was looking up at the night sky at my brother's house in Santa Cruz, and I had a moment where I actually felt the distance. I imagined it, and it was almost a physical sensation of complete overwhelm, that I, for a moment, cognitively understood the distances, and I felt very insignificant. What I've come to learn now, though, is that if you were to go to the farthest reaches of the universe, it's 1 times 10 to the 30th power in terms of the size. In other words, it's 1 times 10 to the 30th larger than we are, which is a big number, 30 zeros. But if you were to go down to the smallest known particles, the quarks, that's 1 times 10 to the negative 33rd power. So we're actually more than halfway bigger than the smallest thing when you look at the size of the universe. It's interesting to think humans are positioned between the smallest and the largest things. It's a pretty cool thing to think about when you think you're insignificant. The next big one was the Big Bang, when up until 1966, when I was 5, I didn't know about it. My parents didn't tell me about it. But I was 5 when it came out, so you can determine how old I am. But at that time, everybody believed that the universe was static, fixed, everything was in place, it had been there forever, it was eternal. And all of a sudden, they decide to tell us, based on the work of Einstein primarily, that the universe is actually in an emergence and an expansion. And they say that it began all matter in something as small as a grain of sand, which is really hard for me to fathom. And it's one of those things, I think it was one of the ethnobotanists who said, science is premised on this notion that if you just give us one free miracle, we'll take care of the rest. And the one free miracle was that all matter and all energy known in the universe began as a watermelon seed-sized object or smaller. So that was another big shake-up moment. And what's important to know is that they thought the universe was eternal, fixed, static, and that all the laws of the universe are fixed and static. And then they realized that it's an emergent universe. But what they didn't do is they didn't say, well, maybe it's also the laws of the universe are also emergent. Maybe it's not a static set of laws around gravity and the speed of light. Maybe everything is in an evolutionary emergence. And if you actually read people like Rupert Sheldrake, who studies over the last 100 years the speed of light and the force of big G gravity, he says they're fluctuating all the time. And it drives scientists absolutely crazy because it contradicts and confounds what they believe to be true, which is all things are fixed and static and eternal. It doesn't appear to be so. I'm just going to mention a few of the heroes that help inform the school and the curriculum here at Manzanita. James Lovelock, he's 96 years old and still alive, and he was the first one to posit the idea that the atmosphere is actually being regulated. All the gases and the temperature are all being controlled by the living systems of the planet. It's now called biotic regulation, but he was quite a hero, and he was ostracized and ridiculed profoundly when he made his announcement in the late 1960s. He had been working for NASA, and he concluded there's no life on Mars because the gases are stable in the atmosphere on Mars. We don't have to go there. And then he suddenly looked at our atmosphere and said, how can we have things like methane, which is very, very reactive, and oxygen, which is very reactive, in these massive quantities, 22% oxygen in the atmosphere? How can we have all that gas in the atmosphere if it's reacting with everything? He said, well, it's being produced by the living systems. And then he began to realize it's also critical that it stay at that amount how's it staying at that amount for so long? And he posited and did a lot of really important computer modeling to demonstrate that the planet is actually being regulated. The non-living systems, hydrosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, they're all participating in a very symbiotic, interdependent dance with the living systems. I would go so far as to say the planet is alive. It's behaving like an organism. It feels alive to me. And that's the great thing about nature connection, is the more I do that work, the less I have a problem with saying that. And by the way, if you've ever studied human indigenous cultures, they all believe that. Every single indigenous culture believes the earth is alive. And we know that 99% of our human ancestors were indigenous. So I'm kind of in the majority. Maywan Ho. She is one of these brilliant physicists who is really at the forefront. She's a pioneer. And what she has discovered is that this theoretical idea called quantum, it's a form of quantum entanglement. It's when water takes on hyperconductivity. There's a state of water that's not liquid, gas, or solid. And it's actually a molecular state in which electricity doesn't pass at the speed of light, it passes in instantaneous real time. So chemical signals from one part of an organism to another, when all the water in the body of the organism becomes hyperconductive, happens instantaneously. It engages in a quantum phenomenon of quantum singularity. And what she discovered is she took these worms, which are larval state insects, the worm, and she shined bright light through them and analyzed the spectrograph while they were still in their larval state. And she concluded that during certain growth phases of larval state insects, they become, the water in their bodies, which is, they're like 85% water, they become hyperconductive. And she comes to this grand conclusion towards the end of her book. I couldn't get through most of the book because it's really, really rigorous science. She is not by any stretch like new agey in her thinking, but her conclusion is that the entire universe is an acting singularity, quantumly entangled, a single living organism, is what she says, which I think is just really cool. I can't prove it because I can't really describe what she's describing, but I can tell you if you want to get your mind blown, listen to her TED Talks or her YouTube videos. You can only make it through usually the first 3 or 4 minutes, and then you got to rewind because she's really, really smart. Brian Swim is just a wonderful cosmologist, meaning he tells stories of origins. And his goal is to use the story of the emergent universe, the 14 billion year story of our universe, and to say we need to all be telling it. It's the most fabulous story. And it's kind of culminating right in this moment with us talking about it. Because we are the universe. We're an emergent component of the universe. And it's a really beautiful methodology that he's taking to inspire and create really imaginative, hopeful humans. So I'm a real big fan of Brian Swim's, and he's a fan of ours too. So I'm going to have to throw the old timeline at you guys because it's just part of what I do. So we're going to make the timeline of humans, modern-looking humans. That's us, those of us who are Homo sapiens. And if you go back 300,000 years, you get the first modern-looking humans. At least skeletal remains show us that. They always say that they could pass the subway test. You could clean them up, put them in a suit, put them in a subway, and no one would think anything of it. They don't look like Neanderthals. They don't look like Homo erectus. They look like humans because they're modern humans. So I'm just letting the timeline start there, and then I'm taking us to 2017. And the question I always ask people is, if you go back to the most ancient civilizations, the Egyptians with those giant pyramids, where do they go on the timeline? And I always ask people to tell me. And a lot of you know because I ask these questions often. But someone who doesn't really know, where would you put the Egyptian pyramids on this long timeline? Does anybody want to just take a stab at it? Benjamin, where would you put them? Tell me when to stop, Benjamin. Where would you put the pyramids? Right there. Right there, Benjamin.
Stop.
Benjamin would put the pyramids here. Well, lo and behold, farming is here. Thank you, Benjamin. And the Egyptian pyramids are just right there. And this industrial revolution was right there. The technological revolution, you kind of need a microscope. But this isn't the whole story, because modern-looking humans actually were really interesting bipedal pre-humans before that, so I'll show you real quickly. So if you just extend the timeline a little further back, this is to scale, and then you've got the first fire makers. That's controlled use of fire. It's about 1 million years old. And then if you want to go to stone tools, you got to stretch it all the way over to the corner of the room, or further probably. So that's our legacy, and that's important for us because we evolved within nature, both physically and culturally. So what does some of that look like? Well, there's three kinds of symbiosis. I want to mention them. One's called commensalism, one's parasitism, the other's called mutualism. The most common one is this last one, mutualism. We'll get to that. But commensal symbiosis would be an example of barnacle and the whale. Barnacles eat by moving through water. They're filter eaters. So they latch onto the fin tips of large whales. The whale's unaffected. So this is a benefit and no harm symbiosis. One animal's benefiting or one organism's benefiting, the other is not having any specific consequence of any kind. Then there is the classic parasitic symbiosis. Does anybody know that bird? Sean, you know that one? That is a brown-hooded cowbird. Yeah. And that bird followed the bison. That's where it got its name. And so it didn't stay in any one place very long. And it would leave its eggs in other birds' nests. And when the hatchling arrives, it kicks the other birds out. And the hatchling gets raised by the host bird. And what's really interesting is that this bird, this cowbird, engages in something that ornithologists call mafia behavior. Which I was really curious, like mafia behavior. Yeah, so what they do is if they usually go back and check the nest in the first couple days before they fly on. And if their egg has been kicked out of the nest, they ransack the entire nest. It's kind of like, we're going to leave this egg here. And look, everything's going to be fine. Don't mess with the egg, because we might have to come back and talk to you guys. So that's mafiosa behavior by the cowbird. And that's a parasitic benefit and harm relationship. And that's a form of symbiosis. But the most common, most well-known, and the most prevalent throughout the physical natural world is mutualistic symbiosis. This is a bat, nocturnal pollinator. And this is a human and a dog. And some of you may not know, but humans and dogs are actually historically symbiotic. There's a benefit and benefit relationship. Companionship, affection, protection, hunting, feeding. So that's mutualistic symbiosis. It is the most common, as I said. I'll show you a few examples of it, because they're cool. This is a plover, cleans the teeth of the crocodile. Crocodile doesn't eat it. It's a well understood relationship. You take the bugs and I won't eat you. And then there's the oxpecker bird that cleans the impala's ticks out of its ears. This is a sea turtle, and these are yellowfish, and they clean bacteria off the sea turtle and algae. This is crazy. That's a moray eel, and that's a shrimp. And the shrimp cleans out the teeth of the moray eel. Pretty cool, right? This is a thing called a cleaner fish. A lot of these symbiotic relationships are kind of around cleaning. Have you noticed? This is a cleaner fish. That little fish goes in the mouth and cleans the other fish's mouth. Now that cleaner fish actually is going into a mouth of a massive, very aggressive predator. But the predator opens its mouth and lets its teeth get cleaned. And they have an agreement. It's kind of a cool agreement. Then there's parasites that grow on the gills of some of these really beautiful fish. And these little gobies, these neon gobies, go in there and eat parasites off the gills. Pretty cool. So basically, pollination is one of the really well-known ones. Birds, butterflies, rodents, bees, wasps, these are all pollinators. Eating aphids off a plant is a form of mutual symbiosis. One gets fed, the other gets cleaned. This is one of my favorites in the plant world. This is mycelia. Mycelia connect the roots, wrap around the roots of plants. We know mycelia best as its fruiting body, which is the mushroom. But mycelia do some really wild stuff. They create these networks and they communicate among the trees. So this tree over here might need some nitrogen. And this tree over here might have some nitrogen, different species. The mycelia will actually, in exchange for some glucose, travel all the way over here, get some nitrogen, bring it all the way back and feed it to that tree. And plants do a lot better when they have mycorrhizae in the roots. Here's just a little experiment where they grew this particular little evergreen seedling and without mycorrhizae in the soil, and the other one had it. You can see how much benefit the plants gain. Symbiotic relationship. It's really quite beautiful. Now, symbiosis within the human is one of my favorites. This is a really big deal. It's a tremendous symbiosis, actually. A lot of people don't know about it, but the human body hosts 10,000 different species. That's not organisms. That's species. There are 10 trillion human cells in our body. Human cells. 10 trillion. There are 100 trillion non-human cells in the human body, and they're very small. Between 0.6 and 0.7 nanomicrons versus up to 1,000 nanomicrons for like a fat cell. So they're much, much smaller. They'd probably fill, all the bacteria in the body would probably fill like a half-gallon freezer bag. But they're more numerous by a factor of 10 to 1, some people say 100 to 1. And they have a tremendously significant positive function in the body. Though there are very well-known bacterium that are very harmful, there are the majority that are really there to benefit us, and they co-evolved with us. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But they digest our food. We all know about that. They actually educate our immune system, the bacteria. They make a lot of our vitamins, and they protect our skin. Super busy. Now, one of my great heroes is Lynn Margulis. She's the late Lynn Margulis. She died in 2011. But she was a geneticist. And she, in the 1960s, made some discoveries, and she proposed that evolution is not a process whereby an acquired trait is adaptive and an organism becomes a new species. She says species emerge by absorbing other species. So when two species suddenly become one species, that's how evolution happens. Her theories are extremely complex. I'm not going to go into them. I'm just going to give you a little outline of what she discovered. So here's a cross-section of the human cell. There's a mitochondria. You've probably all heard of mitochondria. It lives inside the human cell. Within one human cell, there are about 100 or more mitochondria. They're called organelles. And organelles are very numerous, and they have functions very much like a tiny organ. So your kidney has a specific function, as your heart has a specific function. Within a cell, all of these little beings have functions that leads them to be called little organs or organelles. Mitochondria has a really important function. It allows carbohydrates to be transferred into a food for the nucleus of the cell. The nucleus is what houses our DNA. It's a very important part of the cell. It needs to be protected. So this outer layer of fluid needs to be kept at a very specific temperature, need to burn fuel to keep it at that temperature, and the mitochondria do that work. It's pretty amazing. Then you have a leaf cell, also has a nucleus, and a chloroplast, which is another organelle, lives in a leaf cell. It does the heavy lifting of photosynthesis. So it turns sunlight into energy for the cell. So think about these two, mitochondria and chloroplasts, living inside the animal and the plant cell. And these little mitochondria and chloroplasts are extremely complex, as this cross-section shows. But specifically, the complexity is that they replicate by dividing themselves, very similar to single-celled organisms. They also have their own DNA, which puzzled scientists for a really long time. Why do these, if you've heard of mitochondrial Eve or mitochondrial DNA in humans, it's actually not our DNA. It's the DNA passed down through the egg of the mother into the offspring. And it's the mitochondrial DNA. They have actually, what Lynn Margulis, that scientist I showed previously, she actually discovered that they evolved from free-living bacteria. And they now live symbiotically within our cells. So not only do we have this 100 trillion non-human cells in our body, we also, every single one of our cells itself has hundreds of these previously free-living organisms, bacterium, that now are mitochondria, and they live inside our cells. So we actually are symbiont. And I sometimes wonder, because I have this identity, I'm Paul Astin, that's my name. You know, I wake up every day, it still feels like me. And I also am beginning to imagine that what I feel to be me and my conscious self is probably the expression of a collective of beings. And it's an interesting idea. It's definitely keeping me up at night. So symbiogenesis is what Lynn Margulis coined the phrase. It means life, together life emerges. And it was originally proposed by a botanist in the early 20th century, and then she really did the major work to present that to the scientific community, and now it's in high school textbooks. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, because symbiosis being this interdependence mutualistically, it doesn't just express itself in the biological world, in the natural world, among plants and animals and fungi. It's also something that I believe binds together in an interdependence human beings. And I'm going to talk about a little bit abstract, a few ideas I want to share with you. So where does this show up? I'm going to say that It shows up in indigenous cultures through the concept of gift giving, but I'm going to talk a little bit about gifts generally. What is the nature of a gift? So what exactly is a gift, you guys? Well, here's a few things. It can't be bought. You can't buy a gift. You can buy a gift for someone else and give it to them as a gift, but you can't buy a gift for yourself. You can buy yourself something, but a gift is something that can't be bought, and it can't be acquired by an act of will. If I force Henry to give me his watch, it's not a gift. So gifts are essentially, they must be bestowed upon us. You want to think of it that way. Delmar came to my house once after going to Rabbit Stick, and he just came over to my house in his truck, and he came and handed me a giant elk antler, and he just gave it to me. And he's done that over the 10 years I've known him. He's periodically just handed me these gifts. And they're nothing like something I could buy. They have something else to them. And I love the gifts that he gives me, and it makes me feel not only grateful, but wanting to give him gifts in return. So it's an interesting thing that he and other people I know do without it being Christmas or my birthday. I want to talk a little bit about artists, because artists are creators of gifts. We often speak of talent as a gift, because generally talents are bestowed upon us. They're not acquired by force of will, and they're not acquired by buying them, although you can improve upon gifts with force of will and with money. But a gift is something that seems to feel like it's bestowed upon us. So the artistic, creative aspects of human beings bear very much resemblance to gifts, and there's other reasons that they do, and I want to talk about gifts and creativity. We often say an artist is inspired in the creative process. I've heard that many artists don't actually feel like their work or their rendering is itself art until they are struck by creative inspiration. That moment arrives in the process of creating, and then they feel they're making their art. Up until then, they're working their craft. I don't know if that's true for you, Dave, at all. But that if there's a moment when you feel like, I'm getting it, it's hitting me now, and I'm feeling it and I'm sensing it. I get that myself in music. I consider myself like a pianist and an artist at the piano. And I also get that in my teaching. I consider myself an artist when I'm teaching. It feels like an art form. And we also know that this inspiration comes to the artist as a gift. It's not like I can will myself to play beautiful music. I can do my best. But that moment when I feel it flowing, it doesn't seem to be by my force of will. So I want to connect these things because there's some ways this might help us see the analogy with cultural reciprocity, which I'm going to get to. So art can also inspire our own, I want to call it spirit, our own creative, our own sense of meaning and purpose. Beautiful art. You pay to go into the ballet or into the symphony or into a jazz club or wherever you go to get inspired by art, and you might pay 20 bucks or 40 bucks at the door, and you may not be inspired. But if you are inspired, that thing that arrives to you as inspiration and beauty and leaves you feeling wonder, it is not connected to the $20 you paid at the door. It's somehow coming to you from the artist, and you may have paid money to be allowed to step in there, and the artist may be getting paid to allow them to do that as a living. But what that artist is offering and what you are receiving is somehow not entirely connected to this commodity monetary market. And that's going to be important in a moment. Gifts and gratitude. When we're moved by art, we often feel gratitude as a response to the art. I have many times needed to go find the musician or the performer or the speaker and just tell them in the best way I can, how moved I was. I just feel that, and it's, again, I don't say, I paid my 20 bucks, I don't need to say anything. I actually feel like that's the completion, that's the circle. That's how I am in balance. And I feel that need sometimes. And so I see this as a connected piece. So what happens when art enters the monetary system? I want to talk about that because it happens. One of my favorite examples is the colorizing of classic black and white films. I don't know if you guys know, but black and white filmography, cinematography, was something that deeply considered value and shadow, and it was an art form. The great filmmakers treated it that way. Well, along comes colorizing. And one of the people that did some colorizing in the mid-1980s was a guy named Ted Turner, owns CNN, and he's since deceased. But he said, when someone asked him, how can you colorize these films, they're works of art. And he said, last time I checked, I own them. That was actually his response, quote, last time I checked, I own them. And I felt something didn't feel right about that at the time, and I've remembered it ever since. There's something about the art that holds and possesses something of the gift of the artist that cannot be touched or should not be touched. It's as if he needs to be the chaperone or the caretaker of the art, but he doesn't get to tangle with its intrinsic gift. So, you guys know where this is housed? Anybody? Where? In the Louvre. And who owns the Louvre? The French government owns the Louvre. So, let's just say the French government decided they wanted to make this a French art object because last time we checked, she's ours. I mean, that would be totally okay according to Ted Turner, I think, but it wouldn't be. We know the gift within the art cannot be owned. We know it intuitively, and so we feel that it shouldn't be altered. So what is that thing? What is that thing? I want to talk a little bit about the idea of giving and gifts in traditional cultures. And I gave you that timeline a little bit back, and I said that the human lived for 95, 99% of its history in small, nomadic cultural groups in which giving of gifts had some very specific frames and ways about it. So one of the things I'm going to suggest here is that cultural symbiosis is a kind of, shows up as reciprocity. And I'll tell you what reciprocity is. First, there are 3 obligations found in all traditional societies. There's an obligation to give. There's an obligation to receive a gift. So you actually aren't allowed to say no thank you. You actually have to receive. And there's an obligation to reciprocate. Now, if you think about what happens there is, if I say, Jonah, man, you're so incredibly styling, I just really want to give you this hat. Jonah's going to have to take the hat. And now what happens now is Jonah has an obligation to reciprocate. He doesn't have to reciprocate to me. This is a really key point. But he cannot hold on to that energy that's in that hat that I made from felt myself. Because indigenous peoples don't go to the store. They make everything. So I would have made that hat and I gave it to Jonah and he took it. Because I love Jonah. And now Jonah's like, wow, I got this cool hat. And then now Jonah's going to gift someone else. And what it does is it establishes connection and obligation, not in a bad sense though. It's this feeling, it's an energy, and I'm trying to connect the gift of the thing I created and gave him with this idea of something which can't be bought and sold. So gifts among indigenous people carry a life force. I happen to know that among the Aborigines in Australia, they call it the Howl. And they say if you're handed something that has the Howl, you have to give it to someone else, or it causes spiritual harm to you. So there's actually a belief in many traditional cultures that if you do not reciprocate in some way, if you hold on to things, it causes spiritual harm. The old phrase, Indian giver, if you look at the etymology of that phrase, it came from the northeastern native peoples who would gift the white settlers, and then the white settlers would gift nothing to anyone in return. And the native peoples, not wanting that to cause spiritual harm, would go retrieve that gift. And then that became a derogatory term for someone who takes gifts back. But it actually is born out of an empathetic desire to not cause spiritual harm to a people who do not understand reciprocity, which was classic. In monetary economies, it's very easy to lose touch with some of these very old ways of connecting and relating. So, I want to say that among indigenous peoples, giving is often the mark of a human being, a man or a woman, is their willingness and capacity and generosity in giving. In fact, there are a lot of rituals. There's the potlatch ritual and lots of other tribal ceremonies. They're about giving everything away. Potlatch actually means killing wealth. And in some cultures, they destroy their entire material culture on an annual basis. So what about gratitude? Among the Lakota, and comes from Saljen Kareli, he was a colleague and friend who spent many years among the Lakota, and he said that the old way of thinking was that the human response to abundance, so the abundance of the earth, which it always feeds us, it provides us our shelter, it provides us our medicines. Everything we need as humans to live on this earth comes from the earth. That's actually still true today. For me, everything I need, my food, my medicine, my clothing, my shelter, my protection, my transportation, everything is coming out of the earth in an abundance. And that the idea was that the human response was just gratitude. Had to be in gratitude to the earth. And that can show up as rituals and celebrations and song and dance and body adornment. But a lot of the human creativity in traditional cultures around dance and song and celebration are acts of grand collective gratitude for the abundance of the earth. And the other thing that Sal Gencarelli said to me was he said, and the other part of the idea was that if the humans stopped being grateful, that the animals and the plants would feel they were no longer needed and they would leave. And that's kind of a powerful thing to notice when we live in a time of a sixth extinction event. And we live in a time where we are not that grateful. I don't express gratitude over my food every time I eat. I'm trying to get better at it because I have an old idea that I bought the food, I work hard, I have a salary, and I paid for my dinner. I might want to thank the waiter, I don't have to thank the food, but actually the food came out of the earth. Because I have a job and I make money, that's still the gift of the earth. It's like the art of the earth. I can't say it's mine and paint a mustache on it. It doesn't belong to me. It's nourishing me, but it's a gift from the earth. You guys get where I'm going with that? Okay. From an indigenous perspective, gratitude establishes balance between the human and the earth. And it is a form of symbiosis between the human and the earth's abundance. It's a symbiotic relationship of human to more than human, which is one of the reasons why gratitude is a core routine of nature connection at Manzanita, together with sit spots and bird language and tracking and animal mimicry and study of flora and fauna and sensory expansion activities and intuitive wandering. Gratitude also reestablishes an old relationship that is genetic to us and that actually helps us develop balance and relationship again with the more than human world. So this commodification, among indigenous people, giving, as I said, is the mark of a man or a woman, a human. In a modern paradigm, getting is actually often the mark of a man or a woman. It's a very different model. And it's different for a very specific reason, which I want to mention. One of them is that in a money exchange economy, so I actually give Jonah the hat and he gives me $5. We're good. Everything is in balance. We're done. There's no energy. Everything is in stasis or equilibrium if you're in a money economy. You pay for it, you get it, we're done. Relationship over. In an indigenous or traditional economy, in a gift economy, the exchange produces the obligation to reciprocate. It's a constant balancing and flow of obligation, connection, reciprocity. There's nothing static. And if we live in a world where our exchanges are constantly about stasis and equilibrium, we can live in that money economy and have no obligation to anyone or anything. We can imagine that. And I want to suggest that's among the features of our cultural time that are human alienating machines. When we live in a money economy, we don't even value art as being outside of the money economy. We buy the film and we colorize it. It's like it's ours, last time I checked. When we live in that kind of a way, it's very, very difficult to reestablish sense of connection. And tribal cultures are very intelligent because they know that there cannot be hoarding, there cannot be imbalance, there cannot be envy. There's even like the idea of envy and coveting. That's something that indigenous peoples challenge and fight all the time. The great young hunter who brings the impala home is obliged not to brag about it because it begins to establish differences. And they have these incredible forms of establishing and maintaining equilibrium in the community. And that has been an ancestral practice of humans for a very, very long time. In money economies, hoarding is possible. In gift economies, material wealth is constantly being given away through cultural practice. Just want to say something about the art of teaching, and I've mentioned this before, because we're at a school that charges tuition. And I've said this to parents in the orientation meetings, and I used to say it in orientation meetings without knowing why, but I would always say, oh, you guys really got to thank your teachers, because the only emails most of them ever get is, I don't understand this math homework. My child's really stressed out. Oh, can I talk to you about that sugar you gave them the other day? And it's like, it's a lot of communication to the teacher about when something's going wrong. When everything's going right, everybody's cool, there's no communication. And the teacher is in the classroom. I can say this at Manzanita without any exception. The teacher's in the classroom giving their gift. They're actually in the practice of giving gift. And many students know that, and they're grateful, and they express gratitude. And they say thank you. Or they're engaged, and they focus, which is another way of being in reciprocity. They show up prepared. They do the assignment. That's the balancing of the energy of the gift giving of the mentor to the mentee. And I can also say that just like someone who paid for their dinner and doesn't have to thank the food from the earth, many, many people, when they pay money for something that's a service like teaching, they still, in my mind, to be spiritually balanced, to use our Aboriginal friends, they actually have to find gratitude. If their child is being gifted, the parent has to be in gratitude on some level. And that can show up in a lot of ways. That can show up as a nice email. It can show up as saying thank you. And I just want to call that out and note that, because as a person who is often working in my gift, I am in balance and nourished, and I feel that things are received when there's noticing that it's being given. And in the same way, if there isn't noticing or acknowledgement or gratitude, and it's not an ego thing, there's a sense of something's wrong. Something's really, really wrong. And I think that as a message to all of us, when we're gifted by a performance or a creative expression or an elk antler, that being in the gratitude and expressing the gratitude is a really, really powerful way to begin to reactivate connection and reciprocity in our culture. So I just wanted to say that about teaching. I'm going to do another one of those things where I read. You can keep your eyes open or closed. The great discoveries of the present moment, that we are symbionts, previously preciously interwoven with other life forms, standing on the ground of a great many beings in the more than human tapestry. This is a celebration, and it is both a wildly inescapable fact and an intellectual detour so vast and unwieldy that many say we best leave it aside. It challenges the most critical paradigm that we probably are all taking for granted, that we humans are special or chosen. And special and chosen by what? By our linear minds and our speech, our gift to fashion the earth into great tools. And these are gifts of the human, to be sure. That they would set us so apart, make us better or best, is actually not an easy leap to accomplish for a species born of connection and generosity. These must indeed be gifts that we share, but we must make the leap, and we are struggling. We must move beyond feeling superior and distant and disconnected and alienated and struggling. And the story of our true connection to all life is now arriving for us to wash away some of the grief of our centuries-long story of loss. We are coming home. So, one of my great heroes, Max Planck, is a great picture of when he was younger. His older pictures, he looks very professorial. But here he looks wild and untamed. And I love what he says here. He says, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. And a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. And I wonder about that, like some of these kids growing up in relationship to the more than human world in a way that I could only dream of having grown up. They're talking to the plants, and they're hearing from the plants. And they're in relationship with the more than human world in a way that feels extremely natural and easy when you're young. And I continually have to work at it as an adult, and I get nourished very much by it. So the question I have then, what truths are our Manzanita youth growing up with, or, stated differently for us, what old notions are we adults better off not taking with us to our graves? So I want to say one last thing here, because I'm really intrigued with the story of the unfolding of the universe. And I come out of a background in anthropology, and I'm really struck by the hero's journey or the heroine's journey The notion that the most critical gift that a human can give to another human is to offer them the gift of their own personal transformation. And that sounds very one-on-one. In the old story, it was, as several of the people who study this regularly have noted, it's a three-stage experience. There's this piece called separation from the familiar, separation from home, family, village. Then there's this ordeal that happens when you're separated and on your own. And it's an ordeal of like slaying a beast or vision questing or fasting or encountering deep unseen truths previously in oneself. And then there's this really important piece where you return and you're transformed, bringing these gifts back to your people. And this rite of passage is essentially what has happened for every young person throughout human history. We see it in every single indigenous culture in the entire world. Hundreds of indigenous cultures have these rites of passage that happen around 13, 12, and they're a little different for boys and girls, but they both involve separation from the community, from the family. The parents aren't involved, the elders and the uncles and aunts, yes, and you're taken away and you undergo an ordeal. And very often there's physical expressions of the ordeal, body scarring, tattooing, and there's an entire transformation. You come back with a different name and a different dress and a different status. You're an adult. It's fascinating to think that adolescence as a word was born in 1896 in a book written by an American expatriate from England, and he coined the word adolescent because that concept did not exist in the human lexicon. It's as a notion of this quasi-child-adult stage. In traditional cultures, you are a child with all the rights and privileges of a child until the moment they snatch you out of your hut in the middle of the night and you undergo hours or days or weeks of ordeals and you return an adult. Even if you're 13, you get to sit at the adult council. You are an adult. So you don't actually have to go through that other stuff. It sounds a little bit unusual to us. We still have remnants of it in the confirmation, in the bar mitzvahs, the remnants of transition rituals. So I want to say something about that, though. This three-part model. Separation, ordeal, and return. It is the story, the primary story in human myths. It's found everywhere. Joseph Campbell, 1949, wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, drawing these stories together from all over the world. It's found in every indigenous culture, as I said, as the rite of passage. And it was probably with us for the last 300,000 years. I spent some time when I was a doctoral student looking at risk behavior in youth because I found that it didn't have to do with gender necessarily. It didn't have to do with socioeconomics or ethnicity. It seemed to be endemic among youth. They do things that profoundly challenge them. And what this woman, Cynthia Lightfoot, found is that they're creating essentially ordeals. And what they're doing is they're doing the dangerous things so that they have a story about themselves that they can share with their peer group. If you hang out with teenagers, that's essentially what they talk about, is the crazy things that they did or someone else did that they know. So it's present in our culture, and in the presence of adult mentors, it helps protect against unhealthy risk. But the thing that I'm really blown away by, and this came to me through a book called The Living Universe that was recommended to me by Nikki Schmidt. And it was written by the same person who wrote Voluntary Simplicity, Aldin, I'm sorry I don't know his name right now. But what he basically is suggesting is that the human, leaving wild nature 12,000 years ago and leaving the mentors about 400 years ago when we started moving from the rural areas into the cities during the Industrial Revolution and no longer apprenticing in the countryside with the weavers and the blacksmiths and the seamstresses, and then leaving the woods 40 years ago when technology became so captivating, that was a form of profound separation that's had these multiple phases. And now many kids are completely separated from the natural world. They don't want to get dirty. And then in the process of this 12,000-year escapade, we have gone through immense struggle and hardship and violence. And now there's this notion that we're learning about this and we're able to return through the new awarenesses, through science, through rewilding, through a great turning, and we can return to ourselves and to our relationship with the more than human world. I love that. So here's a few things I'm proposing. We're in a revolution in human understanding that's rooted in science. and that some of these views are not in the mainstream. The universe is not mechanical. I believe that all matter is alive, conscious, and it's seeking greater complexity. There's something intrinsic to matter. Not just the Earth, Gaia, but the entire universe is interconnected and behaves like a vast organism. All evolution is symbiotic. Organisms merge to form new organisms of greater complexity. So what is the next phase for the human? I really wonder what will happen if we reestablish that deep symbiotic connection with each other through gift economies and reciprocity and building community like we're doing at Manzanita, where we pay attention to each other deeply. And if we combine that with this rewilding, reconnecting with the more than human world, reestablishing a sense of the sentience of the trees and the winds and all the animals, if we begin to recalibrate to an old paradigm with all the newfound understandings we have today, what will that produce? And I believe it will produce a mutual stewardship between human and more than human. And it will be a new organism, I imagine. So I'm imagining that the symbiotic merger with the more than human world will birth a mutual stewardship. And that's all for now. So I'm going to turn off that projector and see what questions or thoughts or anything else people might have. Yes, Mr. Dave Zabosky.
So we're pretty entrenched in this material realism view, and you're suggesting that these changes, we sort of need to see reality differently in order to accept these changes. Like, how do you explain to a materialist the idea of symbiosis in a way that is not mechanical? How do we convince them, or how do we shift that understanding?
Well, the question being, how do we shift that perspective among so many people that really adhere to a mechanistic universe, that materialistic paradigm of Descartes, the Cartesian worldview, from beginning several hundred years ago? I think, Dave, that I don't feel a compulsion to want to change someone else's mind. I do feel really motivated to talk about the discoveries of science that are shaking up the mechanistic worldview. So I kind of want to talk about the work of people like Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock and Rupert Sheldrake and Mei-Wan Ho, and even scientists all the way back to Max Planck and Schopenhauer and people. I want to just bring that sort of culminating knowledge together and talk about it, because I feel like it's already pulling apart the mechanistic universe. There's partly that.
Wait for the others to die.
Yeah. So there's that possibility. Then there's also, for me, to continue my own nature connection journey, my own growing of my sense of interbeing with the more than human world, and pay attention to that and cultivate and nurture that. Because I think if I speak from that, I'm actually symbiotically, I sort of alluded to the idea that, Paul is actually an expression of an entire symbiosis of organisms. I think when I thread into the more than human world, I actually speak more clearly for the more than human world. It's like that connection and sense of interbeing then becomes the voice more clearly. So I think that's my responsibility, is to get as connected as I can and then to speak from that sense. One of our colleagues here, Jennifer, was speaking to a parent last year, and it just kind of came out of her mouth. She goes, I'm not here in service to the parents. I'm here in service to the cosmos. And that's sort of like the idea. It's not meant to be pretentious or arrogant. It's just meant to be, that's who I'm answering to, And it can get very, I want to say, the cautions are, it's very close to looking religious. And it's also teleological, which is the idea that there's purpose and meaning in the universe. It can sound like it's activating old stories that are part of an old empire paradigm. And so I'm aware that I'm speaking like some of those things out loud. And I'm just going to have to roll with it. I do really want to see and study the science and bring that into the conversation. I'm totally mystified and blown away by the discoveries of science. they completely undermine the mechanistic worldview. The work within systems theory, which shows emergent properties in systems, the capacity for self-evolving within systems, that is completely defying the mechanistic paradigm. The Darwinian ideas, I mean, one of these great this guy named Fedor, he's actually a philosopher, but he also is a cognitive scientist. He challenges Darwinian ideas because he says, look, a wing is a really complicated organ to make flight. And the idea of Darwin is like, little small evolutionary changes become adaptive. But a sixth of a wing doesn't make you fly. So how can you evolve to a wing if you've got to go through all these phases that don't get you flight? So, and that's just one of the many arguments that are in place. And then there's a lot of studies that are showing that there seems to be the capacity for organisms to evolve their own complexity. Lynn Margulis does one of the greatest sort of little tweaks, which is I was talking about how bacteria reach a threshold population density and then they behave collectively. Well, one of the things she says is that evolutionary moments happen not because Paul Astin is under stress and now he learns how to fly or learns how to do something differently that Homo sapiens can't do. Evolution happens because the microbiomes and the other organisms who can actually evolve, they have large enough collections of specimens, individuals, that they can actually evolve. She says the evolution is prompted by masses of the symbionts evolving and then evolving the whole organism. And there's a big theory in evolution called truncated equilibrium, because for years all the evolutionary theorists have said, why does evolution not go steady? It just goes like this and then it does these leaps. And so a couple of really important evolutionary theorists put forward this idea in the 70s called truncated equilibrium, which was very complex and hard and unfathomable. I studied it in college. But she says, no, it's happening like that because when a species reaches the moment it needs to evolve, all of its symbionts evolve and then it evolves through the assimilation of new organisms. So that's her work. It's called endosymbiogenetic something theory. It's a very complex term. I'm sorry, I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. It's SET. It's not SETI, like Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. But Lynn Margulis is a great person to study. She's very hard to read, too. I've only gotten through the first 20 pages of her book, but I've reread it about 10 times. And it's a thin book, too. She was married to Carl Sagan, and her son Dorian Sagan and she have co-authored several books together. So fascinating woman, incredible biography of her life. Yeah, really, really interesting person. Super excited about collaborations among individual bacterium. Like she would study how bacteria all of a sudden can come together and create entirely new, apparently new organisms. So she's done some really interesting research, and there's some great video of her on the internet. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the mic will get you onto the video. Sorry.
I have a
Hey,
sort
Chris.
of two-part. I'm Chris. Hi. Two-part question. One of them is this some of this seems sort of innate. We know these things somehow. I would say I'm pretty about as far left as you go. I'm from a very right sort of leaning place. And ironically, we have similar notions of nature and wanting to be in nature, and yet we have this cultural divide politically and sort of socially. And how do we cross that? And number two, there is, I think there's sort of also an economic divide in being able to do these things. If you live south of the 10, most of those kids are 10 miles from the ocean, never seen the ocean, never been to a hike in the mountains. And that is the next generation. And they will have had no exposure to these things. And how do we bridge those divides, I guess, is my question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer that, but
that's a great,
I just
great
put that
question.
out there.
I can just tell you my own experience, which is I was very involved in political activism when I was late teenager into my mid to late 20s. I traveled to Nicaragua. I produced a documentary. I put myself in the line of fire in Chile on a human rights mission. I was held at gunpoint. I did a lot of really, really fearless things because I was young and intensely dedicated and committed to changing things in the way that I thought I should. And that even led to me to do a lot of work in northern Mexico in a squatter settlement. And something happened in me where I determined that the most radical thing, or the most truly activist thing I could do, was to try to figure out what was calling to me. And I know I mentioned Joseph Campbell, and he's been quoted as saying, "Follow your bliss." And one of my mentors, Michael Mead, says, no, that he's misquoted. He's actually saying, "Follow your blisters," which is follow that which challenges you and rubs against you and makes you hurt, but also inspires you. And so so as a personal mission, I'm kind of wanting to not concern myself too much with what am I going to do about Donald Trump. But I'm also reading the news and I'm watching my own emotional state, and sometimes it's too much. And I come here and I'm with young people, and I don't want to bring my baggage in about how that makes me feel. So there's a caution there where I'm not going to put my head in the sand. I'm going to stay informed, but I'm not going to get activated. One of my other friends and mentors and colleagues is Lauren Dalberth, and one time she said, the most powerful activism is sourcing from connection. And I thought about all the activists that I spent time with when I was younger, and how many of them sourced from anger and rage, and how powerful that is, and how it doesn't actually do a lot. It breaks stuff that you don't like, but it doesn't make new things that you want. So I'm kind of of the mindset I want to source from connection if I can, whatever that looks like. I think that's kind of a radical agenda. Yeah. And then there's also this piece of...
Basically, if you have that feeling, I should go take some kids for a hike.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And then the piece about like down in the inner city and all of the people who don't have the resources or the privilege that I have. And I'm really, really aware of my privilege. And I'm also doing my best to leverage my privilege without shame that I have privilege based on my gender and my socioeconomics and my race. I have a lot of privilege. I can't even begin to know how it feels to not have these privileges. I just sense that I'm kind of indebted to the privilege and to do the best I can to be in service to the privilege. I worked at an inner city school for 7 years as a bilingual educator in grades 1, 99% Spanish speaking community. And I came to Topanga Elementary, which is this huge socioeconomic shift. And I went through a lot of things, and when I got there and I realized what those 5th and 6th graders were going through here in Topanga, coming from privilege, and how disoriented they were, and then I felt like, okay, well, I'm going to work with them. I came from this community too. I went to Paul Revere in Pali and grew up in Brentwood, and so I'm actually going to work on this situation from my own personal experience. I didn't pay my dues, but I worked as a bilingual educator, and then I felt like what I was offering here and continuing to offer here is actually needed too. So I'm also trying not to play into the trap for me of, well, if I'm not doing more for social justice for the world, then I'm a failure. And I've been down that road a few times, so I caution that not be the motivator. Again, sourcing from the connection, not from the shame or the rage, So I don't know if that answered your question, Chris. But that was a really good question, yeah.
I'm going to rent a van.
You're going to go into nature and you're going to rent a van?
Well, I'm going to rent a van and take people to nature.
All right, cool. I'll help you with that. We'll talk about it. Anybody else have a thought or a query? Hillary Boynton.
I have just comments about this. Is this on? Yeah. I was interviewing this French elder a little while back, and she was talking about how grateful she was for her body. And she was saying, oh, I'm just so, I close my eyes and the colors that I see are unbelievable, and I'm so grateful that I'm able to see and that I have ears and I can hear. And she said, I thank my heart for beating every second of every day when I don't ever give it a thought. And I thank my feet for taking me on this journey, walking me through every step of the day. And I'm like sitting there like, oh my God, like tears in my eyes. And she's just so grateful. And I think about the reciprocity you were talking about of giving and receiving. And I think sometimes we take for granted our bodies and our microbiome and the bacteria that are allowing our eyes to see and our ears to hear and our hearts to beat. And we don't think about what we give back, or we've lost that connection of what, not maybe the appropriate, but it's like you wouldn't give somebody the gift of a sweater if they live on the equator, you know, like, so thinking about the appropriate gifts to give back and what foods really do nourish our microbiome and how we can be more mindful of that connection and giving back to our bodies.
So glad you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally left that out. That we're, you know, like as an environmentalist or whatever, I want to take care of the more than human world, and the more than human world is in here too. So like when I like pound the chocolate cake, I'm like, it's like I'm strip mining the microbiome. It's true. So thank you, Hillary. And Hillary, if you don't know, cooks our universal snack and brings it every day, these really amazingly nutrient-dense foods. And I don't know, I eat them and I'm not hungry for lunch, so they're really good. And you've been saying that for a while, and thank you for reminding me.
Can I point out when it totally hit me when I was on the camping trip, and I don't know what you ate, but it's something that wasn't maybe feeding your microbiome. And then you were so thankful to the redwoods and how gracious they are, and they've held us on this camping trip for the whole week. And at the base of every redwood are these microbes that are feeding it every second of every day. And how, you know, that's what it was, you know, what was keeping it alive. And I'm like, wanted to just shout out, like, Dr. Paul, you are a redwood. Like, but, you know, you have those microbes too. So I think we disconnect from, that we are no different from a redwood, really. So everything, and, you know, we're just one piece of the big puzzle.
I guess there's a reason why so many of the saints and the contemplative traditions say there has to be self-love and self-care. And a lot of us, you know, are very willing to love everybody else, you know. So that's a good reminder. Like, that's actually like loving this symbiotic miracle.
Well, and how do we get back to, I think there's so much confusion about what really does feed us. And now with like technology and just so many distractions, that's why this tool is so powerful, is getting back to the simplest things that have fed people for millennia, you know, or generations. And, you know, it's stepping out of those distractions and being able to go back to what has made us evolve forever.
Yes. Yes to the microbiome. And I started thanking the mitochondria yesterday, like, because I'm thinking they're actually like independent beings that live inside every single cell, hundreds of them, and they're just like busy turning carbohydrate into heat energy and food for my cells. Like, that's just really cool. Thank you guys. Yes, Kamashi.
Well, I'm inspired to express gratitude to you, Dr. Paul, for sharing your gift in such abundance. And what I witness especially is through these teens that I've some known since before being teen, and the high likelihood of them getting out there and solving some of these issues of have versus have not, and of place and time, and what are we going to do with all this stuff. So I see that gift so vividly in what you share here, and that's why I'm so there's got to be some words beyond gratitude, but we haven't found them yet. But they need to be, and more and more superlatives in this category. And adjacent to that is I went to Quail Springs on Saturday, and this amazingly vibrant, dynamic young man who's there on their team now. I was talking with him, and he said they had just done this fundraiser, and all these young people had come back from who had been in previous programs there, sharing about the things they've done in the world. You know, these just phenomenal programs, social justice, and helping people in all different segments of society. And that's what I get is going on here, and in that question of privilege, and some people call it, sometimes in little communities, they say we're preaching to the choir, and I say, well, there's a reason for that, because that's where there's leverage. You know, there's real leverage to get people out there and engaged and moving forward. And I can connect you with a program down the road at the Topanga State Park where they actually do bring kids. And I've taken them on walks, and it's an awesome thing, and you're welcome to join in something that is happening in that regard.
And the purpose of the Institute at Manzanita, which is our speaker series and other things we do, is intending to take some of these ideas that are presented and catalog them and begin to actually allow Manzanita's little work in this small community in Canyon to be available to others in other parts of the world that are trying to activate these kinds of programs in their own communities. So there is sort of an agenda there to not be an isolated, small little community, but to actually be able to have some of this replicated elsewhere. We're going to have a visit from a group that's trying to open a nature school in Philadelphia, and they're coming out, a team of educators that have been doing this for about 4 years. I've been in conversation with them for about 3 years, and they're actually coming to visit us in November. So there are other places that want to find a way, and they're in an urban environment, to leverage some of these technologies of connection and relationship. So it's exciting. Yeah, John.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for the presentation today. It was fantastic. I am new to the Manzanita School and new to the community. And I come from a very mechanical world. And I am slowly learning and beginning to greatly understand what it is you're teaching here. One of the questions I have for you would be, what are some of the foundations, some of the building blocks, some of the first steps to move towards what it is the Manzanita School's trying to, and in many cases is, showing our children? Like, how do I bring this home? How do I start this at the house? How do I articulate this to my son and daughter who haven't even started here at Manzanita School to prepare them for something so fantastically different?
Got some other staff here. Ira, is a naturalist there.
I'll teach you how to parent, John.
Well, just more about like, what does an individual do? What's like a first step to actually bring some of this about? I mean, I really think it comes down to bringing it in your own life, whatever that looks like. You know what I mean? It's like, I've spent a lot of my life here, and that's a great tool. The mind is a powerful machine. And then there's something else that goes on when we're actually out there in the quiet of the natural world without an agenda. It's not about, I'm going to get to the top of that mountain. I'm going to get out in nature and I'm going to go hike and climb a mountain. It's like to actually just take one step beyond the boundary of whatever's been developed out into something that's more natural. And then just, even in your yard, you've got like undeveloped chaparral, just crawl up under some bushes and lay on your back for an hour and see what you see and what you notice and what you feel. Because it's a feeling like that I think challenges the machinations of the brain. The brain can challenge the brain, and then the brain can challenge the brain, and the brain can tell you why this is this way. And it goes back, but then if the body knows something, the brain follows. If the body knows it. And that's where I'm like no longer shy to say that the earth is alive. And I heard myself say publicly a couple years ago, well, I'm not saying that the earth's alive. I'm just suggesting that biotic regulations suggest that the earth behaves as a, you know, it's like I'm actually willing to say the earth's alive. And I'm willing to actually tell you what my personal experience is of that, you know, comfortably. And that's no longer, my head can no longer talk me out of it. So I do think it's an embodied thing. And we live in a world where that is not highly valued. It's looked at as leisure or lazy. You know, just go out in nature. Ira really hit me to some thinking last year because we were reading this Charles Eisenstein, and his whole idea is we're coming out of empire. Thank God, we're leaving the paradigm of empire. We're moving towards a world our hearts know is possible, but we have no roadmap. We, in fact, don't even have the tools to get there because we have the tools of empire. And one of the tools of empire is urgency. I got to take care of this now. I got to get nature connected now. You know, it's like that's urgency. And that just caught me, like I've read that and I was thinking, God. He was talking about an elder from Africa who was having all this missionary work, pulling kids out of his community, and someone said, don't you guys feel an urgency to like do something about all this stuff that the white settlers and the missionaries are doing with your community? And he's just like, I'm sorry, but we don't do urgency. And it was like, they don't do urgency. Like, so he couldn't quite get urgency. And I think like, wow, so what does it mean for me to, because I do a lot of urgency, what does it mean for me to actually just try stopping urgency a little bit? You know? So for me, it's the sit spot. It's like going to a place that's beautiful, that has a little bit of sky, and a little bit of shade, and you might see a bird or two, and you just hang out there. I can do it for 5 minutes, and it's way better than not doing it at all. It's like quantum difference to do it for 5 or 10 minutes. And just, you know, and sometimes you're agitated, especially if you do it a few days in a row, it's not so agitating. But if you haven't done it a few days and you do it, it's kind of like, when's that alarm gonna go off? Because I set a timer, I don't want to worry about time, so it's like 10-minute timer. I'm like, must be by 7 minutes by now, probably at 7 minutes by now. Like my brain's like doing that. And then sometimes everything stops. And I'm like looking at that bird, or I'm hearing that sound, and if even it lasts 30 seconds, something is getting activated in me that is very old, and it's very quiet, and it's very aware, and it is not cognitive, linear, intellectual, something else. And I do know that our indigenous ancestors spent a lot of time in the quiet mind, because they're so sensory activated when they're in nature. I spent a week with a native guy in the Amazon, and he was so sensory activated that he could see movement in his peripheral vision that I couldn't see looking directly at it. And I don't think you can be sensory activated if your brain is online. You know that from driving and missing your freeway exit. You know, it's like it's coming up, you've done it 80 times, and you just drove past it because you're thinking about something. It's like when you're sensory aware, and indigenous peoples could not afford to not be sensory aware. They would not eat, or they would get eaten. Those are the options for you. If you're not sensory aware, you're pulled out of the gene pool pretty quick. So it's like a heightened capacity to quiet the mind. So when you go out to a sit spot, you're doing that. You're remembering that. You're remembering sitting and wait. You're remembering just watching and learning from watching. And that's the fastest one that the people that work in the nature connection world claim that the sit spot is the quickest of all the core routines. I really like intuitive wandering. That's where it's like a moving sit spot. It's like I go out and I'm like, and there's actually some techniques you kind of like, you learn to sort of feel your gut, you know, there's your gut kind of pulling you in a direction. Not your brain, I should go there, there's a cool trail. Oh, I want to go top of that, and you just kind of like do a 360 and just feel your gut. And my gut just kind of says go there, but that looks like a bunch of bushes, crawling through the bushes, and I find something. And then I'm there for like a half an hour. It's like intuitive wandering is really cool. Jenny did one recently for an entire day, from sun up to sunset, just wandering. I've only done, the most I've ever done is 3 hours, and it's really powerful. It's like no agenda, no destination, in the natural world. Super cool, if you have 3 hours. But you know, you have 3 hours to watch a really lame movie or two, or binge watch something, you know what I mean? Like we have the time, and we want to make the time. But even just a sit spot for 10 minutes is powerful. Do that for a couple days. Yeah, on that icebreaker. No, looking out at the sea in the morning as the sun's coming up. What do you think, Benjamin?
I like gratitude. I don't know, as you're talking about the sit spot, I was thinking about what my favorite nature connection routine is, and for me it's gratitude. Just because it's so, like it grounds you so fast and so easily. I just what I was thinking about.
Nice.
Can I say something about that, Dr.?
Yeah, please, John.
I like that. Yeah, thanks for saying that, Benjamin, about how important gratitude is as a routine of nature connection. And one thing I've discovered is that it's even more powerful when you do it with a bunch of other people. Mm-hmm. They're sharing their gratitudes too. And you start to feel grateful for all the things someone else is grateful for. And pretty soon you're feeling all kinds of gratitude you didn't know you had. So yeah, that's a great one. Thanks, Benjamin.
John Young, who's one of our mentors in Nature Connection, there's an audio CD of him. It's a tracking workshop he did. And some of his CDs start this way, but it starts with gratitude. There's like 8 or 9 people in this circle, you can tell, maybe 12. And the first 15 minutes of this audio CD are their gratitudes, but they're, I don't know, they're like super poetic. They're like feeling a lot of gratitude for the morning sun that burns the dew off the leaves and adds warmth to the ground and to my body when I rise in the morning and sit outside. Just feeling a lot of gratitude. And these gratitudes are for all these natural things, but they're also poetic. And like you listen to that and it's like, I just want to learn how to do that. Like to be more prosaic in my gratitudes. So I'm just reminded of that. Because it's a group of people and you're like come away after hearing that like going, I feel kind of grateful right now. What do you think, Zaboski?
I wanted to ask you, actually, there was a question earlier. And in it you said something about how, talked about briefly about the things that you have done in your past as someone that was younger. And then in your presentation you also talked about kind of the rite of passage and the hero's journey. And I know you talk to us sometimes as your students about it, but I don't know how much you've talked to the community as a whole about that and how there's a need for a positive rite of passage where you can go through a transformative experience without getting yourself killed.
Mm-hmm.
So could you speak to that a little bit? Because you have made my view of that really important for me, at least. It's been something that I want to transition into in my life, is having one of those kinds of rites of passage where I toil with something and I go through something inside of my life that's deep in experience, and that I come out on the other side and I have gifts to give to my community, because that's something that I find really important. So.
Yeah, that's a great question, Grace. What you did this summer, going up to Quail Springs and doing that sustainable vocations, that has qualities of that. You know, you left, you underwent some challenges and some like connective thing, like it was intensity, and then you came back. And I think one of the things that's often missing is like people to be able to go, I see you changed. You know, I see that in your eyes. And that's like a wounding when we have transformative experiences, because I have in my life had these moments where things have happened to me and I kind of come back and it's like, hey, how's it going? You know, and so we don't really have a good model of it, I just want to say, but we all have had many, just like the camping trip last year, there were things within that had qualities of this possibility for transformation. Now the question about what is Manzanita going to do, I'm hearing this question, maybe you didn't say this, what's Manzanita going to do for our students to actually provide them with something more substantial in terms of a rite of passage? And that question has been haunting me as a teacher for 20 years, essentially. And part of my challenge with it is, in a tribal culture, when you come back, there's nobody in the whole culture, from the youngest to the oldest elder, that doesn't know you were transformed, that doesn't now see you and treat you differently. And what happens to a kid that gets a bar mitzvah after the whole ceremony's over is they walk down the street and they're still just a punk 13-year-old. And that's really harmful to I think it's like a deep wounding kind of thing. So I have a kind of challenge of how do we give all ourselves these moments of powerful, evocative, whether it's a sacred fire experience, like we all have gone through that, and we know what that feels like. And so we're kind of doing a lot of these mini little, like feeling ourselves transforming, and it's almost like we're all in the ordeal right now. Like the whole community is going through, we're all separated from the culture in a way because we're not buying into the larger picture, although some of us are threaded in our ways. And we're like in the kind of collective shared, because most rites of passage are done as a group of people do it together. There are solo quests too. Jenny just did one last summer, and I'm doing one this coming year. It's a 4-day solo fast out in nature. I have no idea anything else to say about it because I haven't done it. But I'm sort of marking an experience for myself. So I guess I'm kind of meandering, but I want to say I hear that in you, and I look around the room at the young people that are in our community, and I feel like you should, at least by your senior year, there needs to be something that we all see, and we all acknowledge, and we all recognize, and that you experience that is based on separation, overcoming something, whether in yourself or in your past or in your heart or whatever, and feeling the power of the transformation, and then us being able to witness it and welcome it in. And I don't know what that looks like, but you definitely got me thinking about it.